That's it. Thank you, Marina. I call this land acknowledgement. We will always remember the old ones. I will speak a little bit of Plains Cree. So the Cree that you hear, the English that's either before or after is usually the translation. Kika kiskisituta wanawak kakike kite ayesiinawak. Kayase pikisque win nihyowe win. Plains Cree is an ancient language of this land, and I am a lifelong learner of this ancient language. So I will share some of it with you today. 7 days ago, I found this heavy piece of an old tree. Kayase mystic. And I'm thinking about how old this land is. Kayasa Ayawu. And I'm thinking of the importance of remembering the old ones. Kite Ayasiinawak. I will always remember my late father, Moet McElwraith, who passed away in August 2005, and my late mother, Lavona McElwraith, who passed away in March 2024. I will always honor their memory and their spirit. Nika kiskisito tawawak kakike. Just as important as remembering is setting things right. Ikwayaskwaschikeyan. I'm offering this land acknowledgement to begin setting things right with Indigenous peoples. Yini, Ayisi, Inawak. And I want to set things right with the spirit of this land. Otatakwa askik. The spirits of the animals. Otatakwak, Pisiskuwak. The spirits of the birds. Otatakwak, Piesuwak. The frogs, Aikisak. The fish, Genosewak. The grass, Maskusia. The river, Sepia. The sun, Kisika Wipisim. The moon, Tipiska Wipisim. The spirit of the stones, Asiniak. The spirits of the stars, Achakosak, and the spirits of all of creation between the stones and the stars. Nitawi Chike Win. This long ago tree that has turned into a stone also has a spirit. In offering this land acknowledgement, I am honoring the spirits of this land, both human and deeper than human. And I know that this land acknowledgement is only the very beginning, the very first step in setting things right with Ini Ayasiinawak, Ekwakakia Kotakak, Otatakwak, Askik, Equayasquastikeak, Kakiao, Niwakumaganak, Indinawe Maganidog, Equa, Mitakwaye, Oyasing. Hi.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Thank you for starting us in a good way. A few words about our initiative. This event today is hosted by the Indigenous Ukrainian Relationship Initiative that started in 2020 as a collaboration between the Ukrainian Resource and Development Center at McEwan University and Cool Folklore Center at the University of Alberta. Our main goal is to advance knowledge about, explore, and reflect on our Ukrainian Canadian history and our shared Ukrainian Indigenous past in order to build a better future together for the well-being of all. The working group of the initiative consists of 5 individuals, and you can see 4 of us on your screens. It's Myrna Kostash, Naomi McElwraith, Leah Hassoun, who couldn't join us today, Larissa Hajduk, and me. You can read more about our initiative and the work we do on our website, storiesoftheselands.ca. Over to you, Larissa.
Thank you so much, Marina, and thank you, Naomi. The importance of gathering places for communities cannot be overstated. And I think today we had 119 registrations for this event. And we are very inspired of what what kind of conversation can come out of this gathering. We are truly excited to hear from our presenters and to engage in a conversation about the creation, evolution, and community networks that have shaped gathering places at Métis Crossing and within Ukrainian Canadian communities. We are honored and grateful to have Tiffany Shaw and Pamela Trischuk as our speakers today. Thank you. Now I will introduce both speakers, and then Pamela will present first, followed by Tiffany. Pamela Trischuk is the head of education and interpretation at the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village. Drawing on more than 20 years of experience, she blends a personal connection to her heritage with a professional dedication to inspiring people of all ages to explore and appreciate the past. Her work has contributed to the evolution of the museum's interpretation to embrace new perspectives, innovative approaches, and diverse audiences. Pamela is an alumni of the University of Alberta. She graduated with a Bachelor of Education degree in 2004. It is a pleasure having you, Pamela. Métis architect and reimagined Indigenous practice leader, Tiffany Shaw blends art, architecture, and cultural storytelling to create sustainable, community-driven designs of which Métis Crossing is an example. Tiffany is also an artist, curator, and a co-member of the Otiswan Contemporary Art Collective. Tiffany is an alumni, is a MacEwan alumni. She graduated from the Fine Arts Diploma program 20 years ago and also helped work on the design of our beautiful Allard Hall with Reimagine architects. Welcome, Tiffany. And now, over to you, Pamela. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here this afternoon. I'm just going to get my presentation going here. I can just get a quick thumbs up that that's working. Perfect. Okay. Again, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As Larissa introduced, I'm Pam Trischuk. I'm the head of education and interpretation at the Ukrainian Village. I'm excited to have been invited to participate today as the Ukrainian Village is continuing to further our involvement with this project. We've been involved in a couple of different ways, and we were happy to host the project for a weekend trip out to the lands, I believe in 2023. And today we're taking a slightly different approach to what we're presenting today. And I'm just looking at the evolution of Ukrainian gatherings in Ukrainian communities of East Central Alberta. First, a bit of an introduction to myself. I got an early start in my life in connecting with the stories of my ancestors when I spent summers in small town Saskatchewan with my Baba. One of the many activities we did together was to work in the potato field, work, I say in quotation marks for myself. She grew a huge patch of potatoes on her parents' original homestead in eastern Saskatchewan. Any of you who have a Baba of your own probably know that a single garden in her yard in town was probably not nearly enough for her, so she needed a potato field out on the farm. I didn't actually do much working. I think I did more exploring in and around the yard and the house and the farm. And the house in the background there is, you know, the oldest sort of permanent home that my family, that side of my family built on that homestead. And I would just like run around to there and, you know, find old pieces of furniture and old pieces of clothing and dig them out and get yelled at to come back and plant some more potatoes. But it was also during those summers with Baba that I really, she made sure that I learned how to do everything that was important to her. So cooking and baking, writing pisanke with my great-grandfather's homemade tools, gardening, and learning all about the stories and traditions of our Ukrainian culture. Those summers really helped to spark a love of history and culture, which led me to the Ukrainian Village when I needed a summer job in university. Since then, I've spent the last 20 plus years working here, and all of that in programming and education. And my work is sharing the stories and culture of Ukrainian settlers with our diverse audiences. So Ukrainians, non-Ukrainians, Albertans, visitors to the province, and really helping to inspire in them a love of history and culture and an appreciation for the stories of the past. During those summers I spent with Baba, I got to experience many forms of community gathering with her. We would make perehe weekly with the church ladies at the hall. We volunteered to serve coffee at the community bingo. We went to help with church and cemetery cleanups and get together with her friends for tea. Lots of different ways that we gathered. And when I was thinking about this topic, I thought about all the different functions that gatherings serve in our broader communities. They provide shared experiences among members of the community. They provide a sense of social cohesion, a sense of belonging. Gatherings provide opportunities for resource sharing and problem solving, and they're a setting for cultural transmission and including language transmission and transmission of values and demonstration of values. So they're vitally important activities of a community, and gatherings facilitate all of these things, among many other things. But this was just the kind of the context I wanted to frame gatherings in today. The Ukrainian Village itself is a modern gathering place for the Ukrainian community in Alberta today, as well as the broader community of anyone who wants to learn about Alberta's history. We have more than 40 historic structures that have been moved from their original locations across East Central Alberta and restored to their pre-1930s appearance. An extensive research program has also documented the history of these buildings, the individuals and families associated with them, and the communities that they came from. Our museum is located just east of Edmonton alongside Elk Island National Park, and we're just kind of on the edge of the East Central Alberta settlement area that our museum studies and that I'll be talking about today. Our museum exists because of the significant Ukrainian immigration to Canada, starting at the end of the 19th century. Ukrainian immigration began in 1891 and steadily increased until 1914. When we speak of Ukrainian immigration history, we look at 5 distinct waves of immigrants. The Ukrainian Village itself looks at the first and second waves of immigration. My focus today starts with the earliest settlers of that first wave. Those Ukrainians arriving in the first wave were primarily from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, specifically the Crown lands of Galicia and Bukovina. These Ukrainians of the first wave of immigration were largely agricultural peasants. Ukrainians in Galicia and Bukovina primarily lived in rural villages of varying size, anywhere from hundreds of people to thousands of people. Churches in the villages were a primary gathering place, and clergy had an important role in community and cultural life. Markets allowed people to contact others from neighboring towns and villages for information sharing and obviously exchange of goods. Among the less educated and less literate Ukrainian peasantry, chitalny or reading halls were a vitally important source of news, information, education, enlightenment, and community connection. Chitalny were also places that Ukrainians could learn about immigration opportunities and hear readings of information resources that would help with immigration. Upon arrival in Alberta, however, none of those gathering spaces existed in Ukrainian settlement areas. Ukrainians were not able to settle in villages like they were familiar with. They were limited to one family per quarter section of land, which put the nearest neighbors half a mile to multiple miles away. Isolation from communities and the realities of survival and homesteading forced a shift from a community focus to an individual focus in all aspects of life. Without community gatherings, the focus turned to individual practice and expression of culture or religion. Time, energy, and whatever monetary resources were available all had to be put towards the development of the homestead, housing, crops, gardens, care of animals, other necessities of life. So building and creating the community structures and organizations had to naturally take a back seat in those earliest years. The relative isolation of Ukrainian settlers and the lack of established support for those earliest immigrants meant that they had to rely on others around them for support and assistance. The earliest Ukrainian settlers did rely on Indigenous people, and in some cases, other settler groups, for knowledge and support. In many cases, the survival of individuals or families depended on the assistance that they received from others. We do have many anecdotes of people who were potentially ill-equipped for the weather and had to be taken in from a storm, or people who were given food and shelter when they were on their journey to a homestead, and their survival really depended on that assistance that they received. Indigenous people in East Central Alberta helped Ukrainians with knowledge, navigation, exchange of supplies or goods, and midwifery, a really important role of the Indigenous people that connected with Ukrainians in the earliest years. The connections made between Ukrainians and Indigenous people formed bonds between the two groups that we've only begun to fully appreciate and explore. The hustka or kukum scarf has come to be a symbol of these bonds from the earliest contacts between Ukrainians and their Indigenous neighbors. By 1900 to 1905, newly arriving Ukrainian immigrants were already coming into a very different context than the earliest years of settlement. Ukrainian communities in East Central Alberta were being formed, settlement patterns had established themselves. People are naturally drawn to familiar people, so shared language, religion, village or region of origin all helped influence later arriving Ukrainian immigrants to settle near people like themselves. This chain migration grew the population of Ukrainian settlement areas very quickly. In 1905, the first railway line through East Central Alberta was completed, marking a major turning point in the region's development. Ease of migration into the region improved with the railway, which further increased settler arrivals. Connections with the broader world were also established through the easier transmission of information and goods with the railway. And more non-Ukrainian settlers began to move into the region to work in the businesses and services of the railway town site. So the grain elevators, businesses, and dealerships servicing the rural Ukrainian population were primarily operated by non-Ukrainians. This introduced new cultural contact with non-Ukrainian people, which becomes important a little later on in our story. As more settlers arrived, they began to form new versions of community with neighbors on nearby homesteads. This map shows the earliest Ukrainian settlers from the Edna Star area in Lamont County. Each quarter section, each square, small square with the names on it, is home to a single family, and settlers were only able to take out homesteads on about half the available lands in the region, further spreading out the individual families. In this dispersed context, the first gathering place that emerged was in individual homes. People gathered with neighbors for prayer services in homes, or they would come together with each other to lend a hand with work when possible in those earliest years of settlement. Gatherings in this dispersed phase were important to establish a new sense of community among Ukrainian settlers in the new land, and to begin nurturing those community bonds between people who were probably strangers or at best from the same village. They didn't know each other and have relationships before they settled here. Continued population growth started to provide the people and the demand for dedicated gathering spaces in these new communities. Because the sense of community had been fostered during that dispersed phase, communities were able to grow and come together to create dedicated gathering spaces like churches, stores, and community halls. As homesteaders moved through the first years of farm development and started growing their farming operations, the time and the money required to build and run gathering spaces and community institutions became more accessible to them, which also sped up the development of those spaces. As more and more gathering spaces and services were established in East Central Alberta, the definition of community membership and bonds continually evolved. Because of the dispersed nature of settlement, the earliest rural communities were also established in a very dispersed context, much less organized than the defined villages and towns of Galicia and Bukovina. We can see this dispersion on this map showing the Two Hills, Harry Hill region after the Canadian Pacific Railway was built in 1927-28. The red dots are post offices, the yellow dots are schools, the orange rectangles along the rail line are the newly established town sites at Harry Hill, Kaland, and Two Hills. And then the white squares with the black dots are individual homesteads. So each of those represents a single family. Looking at the families circled in red, we can start to see how they might be part of several overlapping communities at the same time. They might get their mail at Kaland, but the children go to school at Harry Hill because they're within the boundaries of that school district. And then they might attend church near Boyan because that's the nearest church of their specific denomination, or maybe that's one of their family churches. The other members of this district all likely have their own unique combination of communities that they belong to. All of those communities had their own forms of gathering, their own forms of tradition, and they all nurtured various bonds among the members of the communities. So schools are nurturing bonds among children, churches are nurturing bonds based on your shared religion and religious tradition. And all of it matters where you interact with people and where you get information from. Looking specifically at cultural practice, we also know that Ukrainian cultural practice continued to evolve in the Canadian context. This created expressions of culture that are unique to the Ukrainians of the Canadian prairies. Ukrainians had to adapt their calendar customs to a new climate. Holidays marking the start of spring in the old country, for example, fell during winter in Alberta, the late stages of winter. Religious feast days celebrating the harvest might be happening in the church calendar weeks ahead of the crops actually being harvested in Alberta. Ukrainian cultural practice also had to adapt to larger and more time-intensive agricultural operations, which reduced the time that was available for gathering and for cultural activities. In addition, contact with other cultures continued to influence Ukrainian Canadian culture and practices. As one example, by the 1920s, Ukrainian Canadian brides were commonly getting married in English-style clothing and dresses, setting aside the traditional clothing of previous generations. The weddings were still largely conducted in the traditional way, surrounded by the activities that were traditional, but elements like clothing were starting to adapt to the Canadian setting. Leisure activities such as baseball, dances, plays, musical concerts also became part of the Ukrainian community context. These activities were not part of the traditional activities of Ukrainian communities in Galicia and Bukovina in the form that they took in Alberta. And those activities come from the influence of the non-Ukrainian community around the Ukrainian settlements. This unique combination of factors in East Central Alberta led to the formation of new cultural and community bonds among the Ukrainian settlers. So gatherings are just one example of how culture adapts and grows in unique contexts. And the Ukrainian settlement of East Central Alberta is a unique context. Cultural practice, the environment of settlement, and the realities of homesteading life all impacted how gathering places and practices evolved in East Central Alberta. By looking at this evolution of gathering in East Central Alberta, we can see that the social and cultural bonds among the Ukrainian settlers led to community gatherings, which in turn led to a sense of community that furthered those social and cultural bonds. And the process just continues to repeat as, East Central Alberta's Ukrainian community develops and grows, and it continues to repeat today. The Ukrainian Village is proud to be a gathering place for Ukrainians in Alberta, for Albertans, for local Albertans as well. And I hope that after this, the next time that you're gathering with one of your many communities, you'll think back to this talk and kind of give yourself a pat on the back for furthering, nurturing those important social and cultural bonds within your community, and maybe see those gatherings that we undertake through a new lens. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for your time and for inviting me to participate today.
Thank you so much, Pam. Thank you. Very informative and inspiring. And now over to you, Tiffany. You are muted.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Pam. That was a really great presentation, very inspiring to see how the evolution has occurred. And I hope that I can kind of connect to some things. I'll be presenting on Métis Crossing, which is a community of networks and development. When we are, oh, I guess I should introduce myself formally. So this is my family. I'm sitting in the lap of my great-grandmother, which we call Granny, Margaret Paulin, and then on my left is my grandmother, Elizabeth King. My mother's on my right, Brenda Fearon, who's deceased, and my older brother, Jeffrey Shaw. A lot of my work revolves around these figures in my life, including my brother's children and my own children. And the three older women in this picture, they all come from the Fort McMurray area. We're Métis, and we came from the Red River a few generations prior to that. And I am so proud to be a part of this Métis Crossing project, but also a part of Reimagine Architects, which is the office that I have been working at for about 10 years. Reimagine really focuses on a lot of different types of cultural institutions, but my core work is where they've also been practicing for over 20, 30 years, which is around Indigenous structures. And what's really nice about this company too is that there's a real heart around sustainability, which is in alignment with Indigenous people. So it's been a really wonderful journey working with this company. And I also have my own sister company called Reimagine Gathering, where I have an Indigenous consultancy that pairs with Reimagine Gathering or with Reimagine Architects all the time. So we're today discussing Métis Crossing. We've been involved with Métis Crossing since 2000. And in terms of when we're looking at different types of lands, different Indigenous groups look at Canada, or the land known as Canada, differently. So if I was Inuit, I would look at my territories differently than if I was Métis, than if I was First Nations. So we have the treaty territories, which we're in Treaty 6 right now. And then we have the Inuit territories, and then this is the homeland of the Métis. This actually is a bit divisive, the homeland of the Métis map. Really kind of depends who you're talking to about where people would put these boundaries. But it just shows how we're a diverse makeup of people who formed prior to the land being established as Canada. There's this one sort of joke that Juanita Marwa, who's the CEO of Métis Crossing, she says that the first Métis person that was born was 9 months and 1 day after the first European came to the area. So it's really, we're a unique composite of people who have formed with First Nations women and European tradesmen, and we have reestablished ourselves through marriage and through the celebration of our own culture, such as fiddling, and we have our own language, which is Michif. And so we are a diverse set of group of people that is not First Nations, but we are related to First Nations, for those who are curious what the difference is. So this is our homeland nation, and in Alberta, we actually have 9, I forgot to set my timer here. We have 9 or 8 settlements, Métis settlements, which is really unique history for Alberta, so I encourage you to look into that. But we also have the Métis Nation of Alberta, which is separate from the settlements as well. Métis Crossing is an hour and a half northeast of Edmonton. I also put the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village here, so you could just sort of see the close proximity. And it's along the North Saskatchewan River. This is a view of the historic Métis Crossing community. They came from the Red River over to establish trading partnership with Victoria Settlement. And so the Victoria Trail is what Métis Crossing is sitting upon, which is the trail that connects all the way back to the Red River. So it's this deeply embedded historical footprint that is quite significant. There's also actually a historical Ukrainian community close to here as well too. So there was this sort of nexus between Victoria settlement, the historic Ukrainian community, and Métis Crossing for a period of time. These river lots were created in the 1800s, and then the family slowly moved away over time. And then there was a German farmer that had the land where Métis Crossing is now, and they sold it back to the Métis Nation of Alberta. And so this is the approximate area that they currently own, which is quite remarkable. And you can even see like the Victoria Trail when you're on site. You can sort of see the remnant of that trail still following here, which is where the Red River carts would drive across. So when I'm looking at the area here, 688 acres, I think Métis Crossing has actually expanded. They are continuously absorbing new land, but this was from one of our master plans we're looking at a few years ago with them. So the goals and objectives, well, just to step back a second. So we've been working with them since 2000, and we had created or expanded a little bit of a park for them, some washroom facilities in 2008. And then in 2017, they received some funding to create the Gathering Center. And that's when I came onto the project. And these are the goals and objectives that they set out for the Gathering Center, but these still hold true for all of the projects that they still expand upon today. So it's to celebrate the culture and history and contributions of Métis people in Canada, to provide a facility that is a versatile hub of activity with Métis story at the center, emphasize the connection to place and to land, as well as support an inclusive environment that upholds intimate knowledge of Métis culture and history, and mirrors the values of the Métis community, which are part of self-sufficiency, respect of elders, participation of youth, and pride in Métis culture. So those are the benchmarks that we always utilize in projects. We also were looking at the intermixing of all things. I heard Pam talk a lot about this in terms of mixing tradition with contemporary practices, and this is of no exception either. We're always looking at past, present, future when considering how is food being consumed at Métis Crossing, what are the learning styles that need to be addressed, and in terms of reconciliation or education, and what are the built forms and how does that feed into the ecology or the utilities, for example. So this is an entire network that needs to feed into itself, because that's how Indigenous people have always maintained their resiliency through the different environments. So they have historic cabins on the site, and so you can go and learn, and there's interpretation there. And we've tried to look at the different typologies on site when we were designing the Gathering Center and all future buildings. And there's quite a bit of life and history. So this is a historic barn there that's built by a Métis family, and these Métis cabins are also have the Cromarty and the Sinclair family. These are some of the washrooms that we built in 2008. And then this is a really great bandstand that they play music at or do fiddling at. What's really important too, though, is not just what do the buildings look like on this historic site, but what are the durational activities that happen during the different seasons? Like what is it that this area gives life to, and who are the people that support it and tell these stories to be enduring? Another component when working on these projects is what is the craft atmosphere, and Métis craft work does look different than, say, Blackfoot craft work. So how can we make sure that we're calling out things that are of ourselves rather than from other places? When we're looking at the Gathering Center, which was built in 2019 and opened just before the pandemic, we tried to look at the historic cabin in terms of coloring. We also used historic details for the corners of the building. And in the design, we were able to kind of come up with a connection to the infinity sign and also the Métis Crossing logo, which is a crossing, of course. And so that was a nice happy accident where when we were originally designing the building, we did it with an inverted roof. And the client wasn't necessarily sure that the general Métis community would accept this building with an inverted roof. And I kind of agreed, because we need to make sure that younger and older and people feel comfortable in this place together, because this is a community building. And so I was thinking harder about how can we make Métis people feel comfortable. So I said, well, let's put an A-frame beam underneath the inverted roof so that people still feel sheltered and it still feels like a traditional community hall. And then the mechanical engineer was like, oh, well, then we can run the ducting through that scissor cross. And then we can also put operable windows so that we still have passive ventilation coming through because we have no air conditioning in this building. This is a passive house ready building, which is a different type of designation for sustainable building practices. And then we worked with the structural engineer to create historic wood piece, historic and contemporary glue lamps together in the same room so that there's this feeling of new and historic together. And it started to then just by accident start to look where you get that crossing or that infinity sign out of here. So that was kind of a nice evolution together, which is what our firm always tries to work together is we with our clients and with our teams, we always try to work together rather than individually. So this is a plan of the Gathering Center where we have an outdoor deck and we have an interior gathering space and then we have classrooms. And so we thought about this as a one-room cabin, which is like a historic cabin where everything moves around and as you need it, and you can separate these spaces into 3 spaces when you need it, or we can have movable doors between these spaces so you can transfer and move beyond. You can see into every room. There's that movable door, for example, and you can see it onto the deck. And this large deck, so we had heard from Métis Crossing that they wanted to build this for 700 people for their annual General Assembly, which happens every other year at Métis Crossing and happens in another location across Alberta for the other year. And to build a facility for 700 people inside was an expensive adventure that we weren't sure would be sustainable long-term financially. So we discussed creating an outdoor deck for 350 people and an interior space for 350 people, and then people can flow between. I always just say that I'm not sure if you've been to many Indigenous political events, but sometimes there's like yelling, or sometimes there's like your rude uncle or your like gossiping aunt, and you just kind of need space from them. So I always feel like this helps you move your body where it needs to be during these very difficult conversations, but you can still be connected to your community and the conversations without feeling violated. And so not, I think I know you all know what I'm talking about. So this is really around this idea of trauma-informed design, which is helping people experience these buildings in a way that speaks to them in their place and allows them to transport themselves to a place of healing. And so I think that's what these kinds of buildings do for many people. And so what also happened, what was nice about this large deck, is that it started to act like a large vestibule. This is south facing. It's facing the river just beyond the band shell. And so in the summertime, it is a few degrees cooler from shading from the sun. And in the wintertime, it is a few degrees warmer. So it really extends that outdoor engagement. So the idea around land-based learning is a core principle for Indigenous people, and this helps extend that capability in a temperate environment where your body feels a little bit more comfortable. And so I really encourage for you to see it through all different seasons. It's quite a lovely view. This was the annual General Assembly in 2020, I believe, and they had 1,000 people at this facility, social distancing remarkably. And so it was nice just to see this building come to life so quickly. There is this detail here. It's a bit of a, this is like an architecture detail. So what ended up happening is we had these glue lamp beams and these timber beams that came together, and I was nervous about them butting up against each other. I thought that it would not look that good. And so I was thinking about this one library. This is Henri Labrouste in Paris. It's a library where steel just first started to be introduced as a building material. And if you can remember, during the Industrial Revolution, people didn't believe that the steel would hold up the buildings because they were so skinny. They really felt like they needed this large, heavy stone object to keep buildings up. And so I wanted to reference this because Métis people are very ingenuitive with how we operate. And so I wanted to separate those two materials with the thinnest piece of metal possible, so that we could show that this building is almost like the roof is almost floating in a way, or to show the strength of metal and wood together. And so this is just an architecture geek kind of detail for you all to know about. the other thing we tried to bring into the building is these traditional construction details. So this is the dovetail-like joint that's utilized at the 2 cabins on site. And this is a superior detail for weathering because the water wicks away at the edges, and then it doesn't allow the joints to expand and combust. And so I tried to use this in some of the interior treatments around the fireplace. There's another one on the kitchen table. I changed the location of it so that it's this kind of fun detail. This kitchen table moves all around. And then this is all of us like planning for the hotel, which is the boutique lodge. And there's my daughter Aurora. And then this is my daughter Aurora and my son Jasper. They're just like a few years older now. So we built a boutique lodge with Métis Crossing opened up in 2022, I think, or 2023. And it's a 40 room lodge where we're trying to bring this sense of home for people. A lot of the people during our engagement sessions talked about how they wanted people to feel like they're visiting their grandmother's or their auntie's place. And so we really reflected on a lot of the materials that we used in this space to make people feel comfortable, but then also to feel like they've arrived at a destination where they're going to be creative. And so we used a lot of the detailing from the gathering center here too. I was also trying to focus on how can they feel like 2 Métis people were building this with their own hands with some of these details, and how can we allow for lots of flexibility. Juanita really wanted to make sure that we could separate the king bed into 2 separate single beds in case there was tour buses that came through with a hockey camp, for example. Accessibility was a prime consideration on this site, and one of the board members consulted with us heavily in terms of how this site should be experienced from a wheelchair, from a cane perspective. And Juanita really wanted to connect these 2 buildings together. Even though there's a lot of outside experiences, we wanted to try and find a way to continually think about how can people experience this without being exposed to the weather too much. So this is Jasper and Aurora just showing you how to connect to those 2 buildings. And then you can see them together here. They also did a monument, a veterans monument at this site too, that we were really happy to design with them. This is where you can learn about all the wars and the battles that Métis people have fought in since the beginning, that forms our history as Métis people. And then we've listed the veterans' names on glass panels. And so as they add to the different wars that continuously happen, we can reconstitute the glass and reprint them. And we also use similar craft details, but made them out of like concrete, for example. So I was just trying to think about how can we really mark this honorable thing that people are doing to move our initiative forward as Métis people for our rights, but then how can we do it in a respectful way? So I was thinking about the materials where this is an aluminum post. They had these really beautiful wood posts at Métis Crossing, these historic interpretation panels, but they actually are not weathering so well. They're replacing them slowly, but I loved how they looked. And so I copied the same detail, but made them out of aluminum. And then I had a fabricator use a zip disc to cut into the metal to look like birch trees. So it was like it's like a mock detail in a way. Because I'm always thinking about how can materials tell a story and how can we misuse them a little bit and further the agenda. So we've been working on a master plan with Métis Crossing, like I said, since 2000, and we got it into that in 2019 to expand their services. We're looking at what is the ecology on the site, what is the food production, what is the activities on the site throughout, like there's cross-country ski trails, there's snowshoeing, there's horseback trails, there's star storytelling, there's berry picking, but then also what is our utility connection? They also have expanded to do, and it's recently opened, I think it's been open for about 1.5 years now, their solar field. And another component is the water. Where is the water coming from? So they had a well that was found, and they now have a water treatment center that's just been online since the summer. So they treat their own water, and they're hoping to also have a wastewater system as well connected. We have a plan for that because it's basically like its own town site. There are so many things that are happening on the site now where they have these sky watching domes that you can stay in. They're quite remarkable. And we didn't do the design of these domes, we did the interiors. And but we are doing a new design of some new domes to complement those ones. We're also working on, which I'm so excited about, a retreat area with a spa. And so I've been trying to convince Juanita to do this for quite a few years, and it's finally happening. So I'm very excited that this will be opening very soon. And one other thing just to connect to this is that they have this Vision, Hopes, and Dreams wildlife park where they brought the bison back to this location. And so you can see white buffalo, prairie and wood bison. You can see elk, white elk, and percheron horses. Percheron horses are very important for the Red River and bison hunting exploration. And so you can learn a lot about that there. And to extend this in terms of how does this amplify the Ukrainian Métis partnership, the person who owns all of the bison actually is Ukrainian Len, and he's been working with Métis Crossing for a few years now to make this partnership happen. And so part of his land, a part of Vision, Hopes, and Dreams is also his as well. Another two things, I was talking with Leon Hunter, who is also Ukrainian and is he's the director of business development at Métis Crossing. He said that there's just so much partnership between Ukrainian and Métis people, so that it's inherent because of relationship through proximity. Because when Ukrainians came here, they became to create these connections and create strong friendships. And it's just because of a byproduct of how the river lots were set up, they ended up being neighbors. But this whole initiative is really only because through proximity, there was a lot of partnerships to help further their own agendas, because it wasn't necessarily the direction of the government to install these. So there was these partnerships just to help kind of create the longevity of their own cultures together. And you can see that actually at the Ukrainian Heritage Village too. There, like a lot of the details that are developed over time were actually through the engagement of Indigenous people as well, which were Métis too. And I found that really quite fascinating, because I think I was designing the lodge when I went to the Ukrainian Heritage Village, and I could see some similar details being evolved over time, similar to how some of these cabins were operating. So that was, for me, really important, and I appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. Very inspiring, and certainly there are many parallels with the Ukrainian village. And we did visit Métis Crossing. It looks like we will have to go back. Very impressive, and so thoughtful. And now I would like to invite our own Myrna Kostash to lead the Q&A session.
Yes,
Welcome.
hello. Greetings. I overlook where I'm, my condo looks over the Saskatchewan River Valley, but as you know, in Edmonton, it's such a deep valley that you have to be like 14 stories up to get a sense of the flow of water. I just look across to the university campus, right? I was thinking of here's before I ask you to respond to each other, if you have questions from each other's presentation, I just wanted to make an observation of leading from Naomi's poem with that incredible piece of wood, petrified wood just found while she was walking along to Grant MacEwan campus. And the sense of what's the spirits that have been there long before we came, whether we're Indigenous or settlers, there had already been a profound antiquity, if you like, or longevity to the spirits of the land. And I would, maybe I'll hold that question. I do have a couple of questions arising myself from what you've been saying, but I want to invite you first, the two of you, to ask each other questions, comment on what you've heard from the other person, expand on something that you want us to know more about before we go to the attendees and their questions. So Tiffany and Pamela, have you got something to say as part of our ongoing discussion together?
Sure. I'll break the ice. I'll go first. The very first thing that jumped out at me was how Tiffany and I both started our story with our families, and the importance of our families in our work, and what we're doing today. So that really stood out, that family as the foundation of what we do professionally is an interesting parallel. I made note for myself about the Percheron horses, because I know that Percherons became a preferred breed among the Ukrainian settlers for their workhorses, and it's something that, you know, feels like it needs a little bit further investigation as to, you know, where did they get the first Percheron horses, right? Who were they purchasing and trading horses with? And so I think there's, you know, a good line of inquiry there that I've made note to kind of take back and dig a little deeper. And yeah, I think the other piece that just stood out was the building that's working with the direction of the sun and the light of the sun coming in. And I immediately thought of, you know, traditional Ukrainian architecture and how it works with the position of the sun throughout the year. And so these traditional Ukrainian homes are built with their houses and their windows and their entry facing towards the south. And the roofs have these big overhangs. And the overhangs are designed in a way that in the summer, the sun doesn't hit the windows, but in the winter, the sun is hitting the windows. And this is, you know, peasantry, right? This is vernacular traditional architecture techniques and building techniques that were passed down through generations and generations of people, working with the environment in a way that I think we see in traditional Métis building and now this modern building at Métis Crossing, which I found really fascinating.
Yes, exactly. I think it's the way it should be. These passive strategies we have, like, we should use what the land is giving us. And the passive strategies are always the easiest ones to do. They're free. Like, the sun is going to come all the time. So, and it's going to get a little bit hotter, but I think it's, when I was looking at those structures, like first the Ukrainian structures that first started were sort of like mud huts in a way that were more underground, more cellar root kind. And I think those are the practices they brought from their territories, but you could see the evolution, and I almost felt like I could hear the whispering of how to change these details to make it suit the climate here versus where the climate had come from before. And I think it was more important for them because it's based on survival, whereas here we are really not as connected to our environments as they were. We're not as lucky as they were, where they could see what would happen during the day and how their environment would get impacted so quickly. And us living in these cities, we forget how important it is to face the sun during different times of the day or different seasons of the year, and then how dangerous it is at certain times of the year. I think also in consideration of what does the water want us to do, how does the water erode our buildings, helps to develop these details in concert with that as well. Because of our freeze and thaw periods, we really have a significant shifting of our environment, and those historic details really help land what works and what doesn't work. So I think that they're really the ultimate things to kind of put on a pedestal. These buildings that are like glass boxes, they actually really aren't very great because the sun comes in and out so quickly out of those structures that they don't really retain any heat or shield away from heat. So I think that there are so many parallels. I'm always really struck though by these Ukrainian Métis partnerships or Ukrainian Indigenous partnerships, where it doesn't always seem to me like it's trying to talk over each other. They're trying to celebrate their own cultures, improve upon their detailing, or improve upon their systems so that they can continue their lives, share it with their generations of family, and thrive. And I think that's what I've always really appreciated about these partnerships or these stories, like the Kukum scarves that we call them, that are the Ukrainian scarves. I remember I went to my doctor's office the day that the Ukrainian-Russian conflict broke out, and I was wearing my Kukum scarf, and my doctor broke down because it was for her so important to see that solidarity. And so I think that these things are really important, these ephemeral memory effects. Like, this is what impacts our daily life today and yesterday and tomorrow.
Good, thank you. Talking about disruption, I thought was a very interesting motif. And I wanted to ask you, Tiffany, when the transition occurred in populations from the home base, if you like, the Red River settlement to territories further east and ultimately at what is now Métis Crossing. Was there a disruption there in terms of the way families related to each other? They had their river laws as they did at Red River, so perhaps it wasn't quite as disruptive as leaving a Galician village and landing on a homestead. But were there modifications by making that change in location?
This is such a great question, and this is like what forms us as Indigenous people. We don't live in the same place throughout the full year. When we lived in that time, we would move seasonally. So in my historic records of my family, someone will be born at the Red River, and then someone will be born at Duck Lake in Saskatchewan, which tells me that at a different season they were over probably through the Red River cart trails doing the bison hunt. They wintered in Duck Lake, for example, and then they travel back because my relatives, the following generation, would be back in the Red River. And this is like why I was saying that outdoor learning or land-based learning is so important for Indigenous peoples, because a lot of our practices are outside, connecting to the land, and we just move where we need to based on the season or based on the activity. Like, where do we go for duck hunting? Where do we go for berry picking? And sometimes people will locate there. So it was just a group of families that were moving from the Red River to Métis Crossing to reinforce the connection to the fort, because there was a fort at Victoria Settlement. And they were just, there's usually interpreters, there's trappers, there's traders. And so it was just to kind of fortify the expansion of before the land became known as Canada, and then as it became known as Canada, sort of expansion.
Well, that's fascinating. I have a whole other perspective when I go next to Métis Crossing. And Pamela, I was wondering, given compared to all the activities that Tiffany's just described of a community on the move and then and seasonal and so on, being a farmer on a homestead is a pretty fixed position. You stay with your crop, but we know from those early years of settlement, there was often the men going off to find work off the homestead and leaving women and children on the land. So I was wondering how much of what was happening in the culture all around the homestead could be called gendered, because of the solidarity and the the opposite of mobility, that you have a fixed position on the land as with women and children, and maybe the older people as well, while the able-bodied men are off doing their thing in the woods or on the. So can you respond to some of that?
Yeah, so the transition of Ukrainians coming into Alberta actually did a lot to disrupt the gender roles of Ukrainian people from Galicia and Bukovina, primarily because in the earliest years of settlement, men would be off working for up to 6 months at a time. And women and children were left on the homesteads doing everything associated with the homestead, clearing, cutting down trees, digging out stumps, clearing land, breaking ground, taking care of the animals, everything at all. So the earliest years started that disruption of the gender roles, and it kind of reset gender roles in the Ukrainian Canadian community. And that's one of the aspects that kind of became this unique Ukrainian Canadian prairie identity and prairie culture, was the role that women played in the farm work, even the business of the farm. And it started with that necessity of the men having to work off farm to earn money to contribute back into the farm environment. Though thinking about when Tiffany talked about the sort of seasonal migration and movement of Métis people, that was one of the primary ways of contact and initial contacts between Ukrainians and Métis people was, a Ukrainian family moves in and sets up on a homestead, and some number of months later there's a group of Métis people coming through that they've never seen before, right, as they're making their way to and from whichever seasonal location they're going to. And that was one way that Ukrainians started to make contact with Métis people, was through those migrations, and learning who they were and that they were just passing through, kind of thing, was an important part of them learning their new environment that they were living in, and their new neighbors.
Yeah, this is really an important point, Pamela, because I know in the early accounts from my own relatives, it's not really, the indigenous people are called Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether 3 or 4 generations later we appreciate the fact that what they were Métis.
Yes.
Exactly, on the move.
Yes.
With their transitional encampments and so on, unlike the First Nations on reserves, who we would never have made contact with, right?
Yeah.
So I hope, I don't know that this is something, I mean, Tiffany has really bolstered this, the question and the importance of those initial contacts, that this is with the Métis people that we're talking about there. Yes.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction that we do make, and we've started to make through our understanding at the museum of the history is, by the time Ukrainians were arriving in East Central Alberta, the reserves were established, and the people that Ukrainians were contacting were Métis people or non-status Indigenous people who weren't on the reserves, which was a minority compared to the Métis people in the region. Especially in that Victoria district. So really important distinction to make. And I think as we're exploring these relationships more, we just start to see the refinement in that the influence of the Métis culture and ways of life coming into the Ukrainian Canadian communities.
Yeah.
They're like, and that's the thing, is that Ukrainians were mixing with the reserves as well for trade. But the thing is that when the land became known as Canada, the government dealt with First Nations and Métis people differently. So they worked with First Nations to create reserves. So they worked with large groups of people to make an agreement, a treaty. But with Métis people, they dealt with us individually. So we were given a script, which was the $80 or $160, or 80 acres or 160 acres. We were dealt with individually. So men, women, and children could get a script. And this is dark history in our for many Métis people, because that script never ended up becoming land, or it was taken by speculators and then cashed in for money, and they were never given the money. And so we were often on the sidelines. The reserves have their own host of very important, difficult problems, but for Métis people, we were not generally accepted in the cities because we were too dark, but then not by the reserves because we were too light, or reserves would kind of take us in to help fortify us because we had nothing either. And so there's like this sort of sharing of resources between all of these groups of people in the best way that they can, but through these modest resources that everyone had. One thing that I just want to show you is this article by David Fortin in Site Magazine. He shows how the farms orient themselves. So these are two Métis farms, trap lines, or sorry, not trap lines, river lots versus a Ukrainian. People will always say like, oh, these Indigenous people, they're so messy. They don't know how to orient their buildings, or it's so haphazard, or it looks so junky. Like there's always these racist stereotypes, but actually we're organizing our buildings based on where the sun is, where the wind is, where the rain is. And so it's not always like this logical, clean looking sort of alignment, but you can see how there's this organized sort of, because of where Ukrainians came from, you guys were not allowed to move. You had to stay and locate in one space. Whereas for us, we were always able to move about freely as we needed. And so we put our resources based on what is the earth telling us to do. And so I thought this was a really interesting comparison of just these different lifestyles of our own upbringings that reinforced our values today. But because Indigenous people are colonized, we have these racist stereotypes that continue to persist against us, even though we're the ones listening to the land and trying to persist and create these resilient structures through nature and environment. I'll put this link in the chat for this particular article. It's specific to Métis structures, but it does have this one interesting diagram on Ukrainian farms.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. Before we move over to the questions that are coming in from our audience, I just wanted to make one more observation. I wondered whether either of you have a response to, and that is, these are rural settings. How do you understand the modification of the idea of gathering once populations become urbanized?
So from the Ukrainian perspective, that kind of coincides with also a shift in the type of immigrants that are coming to Canada. So starting in the interwar years and beyond, the Ukrainian immigration shifted from the rural peasantry to, still having some of those immigrants, but also more, I'll call them urbanized, as urban as it was, but educated, intelligentsia, people who in Galicia and Bukovina had been there as the rise of nationalistic thinking and philosophy had come about. And so you had a different type of immigrant coming to Canada in the interwar years and settling in urban areas. And so you had the types of community gatherings that people were drawn to, I think, being more along the lines of like education, enlightenment, cultural activities, rather than the rural context where the church calendar, the church life, those cultural activities were overlapping with the agricultural life, and so that informed the different type of immigrant, the different type of person, informed slight differences in how they gathered and what they prioritized as their gathering places.
Yeah, a difference in political
exactly
alignments as well. So you had a different kind of gathering if you were on the left and you're organizing a strike or something like that.
And that's, so we had more of those Ukrainians working in labor, working in coal mines, getting into organized labor. And that was the type of community and the type of gathering that they were focused on, and that was their main community outlet.
And Tiffany, in the cities, what happens?
Well, I think we're a largely disenfranchised group of people. Métis Crossing is like the closest to a home base that I have with my family, where we can go and share land. So we've always been operating on the edges of urban centers since the 1900s. So it's always been really important for us to find connection to the rural spaces, even when we're in urban, because I'm an urban Indigenous person. I think about programs like Métis Nation of Alberta. They took us, I went applied for a camp, and we went fish camping. We went to a fish camp last winter with my children. Or there's these cultural camps. I go to Fort Vermilion, which is a historic Métis, one of the original historic Métis communities in Alberta. And so it becomes more important for me and my children to connect outside of these urban centers. And I'll use my Métis Nation of Alberta citizenship to kind of reinforce those connections, or through our Native network, try to make sure we are still connecting to, like, a lot of our families like go berry picking in the summer, and a lot of us will try and make sure that we're paying attention, like we'll sow in the winter, and we still kind of follow the seasonal rhythm in our families without formally speaking about it. And it always has this connection to going to the sewing center or going to the berry picking. It's like, how can we create sustenance within our families and pool our resources? So we've always been disenfranchised, but we always try to find little pockets for social connectivity. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in urban or rural places. It kind of just depends where you grow up.
Yeah, and the Heritage Village, Ukrainian Heritage Village, for newer generations now will be the place that they go to if they can't remember a homestead in their family folklore. Okay, so time to move on, but just before we do that, I just wanted to make a point about a current exhibit here in Edmonton called Unceded Voices of the Land, which brings together something like 21 Indigenous architects who contributed to this exhibit that initially was installed at the Venice Biennale. In any event, their website will go up in the chat group. But we could make this nice little segue now, because in that exhibit, there's an elder who describes how the structures that were round meant that the wind could go around a structure, right? And that this was, I thought, a wonderful adaptation if you've got, and water and wind and so on, as opposed to the corners. But there, anyway, that's probably does inspire some of the new architecture to think. Well, Douglas Cardinal is, of course, famous for never having a square corner. Okay. Anyway, who's taking over letting us know what questions are in the chat, please?
So we will, Marina and I will be voices behind the scene. We'll start. We have a couple of questions, actually more than a couple, and we'll start with what are the boundaries for East and Central Ukrainian settlers, and then this is for Pam. And do you have many First Nations folks visiting the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village and Métis Crossing for both?
So to speak to the boundaries, so when I am speaking of, the Western Ukrainian settler experience, it's the territories that were the Galicia, or were Galicia and Bukovina in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the boundaries of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Central Ukrainian experience was more people coming from the Russian Empire. So I guess that's the boundary. There's not maybe a clear direct boundary. We could pull up a map, but we're talking about the parts of Ukraine that were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The other question, do we see a lot of Indigenous people to the Ukrainian village? We don't. We do see some Indigenous visitors coming each year. I would say, other than Ukrainians and descendants of Ukrainians, we see a lot of new Canadians coming to the village to learn about the history of the region. But I would say we've seen more Indigenous visitors in recent years than prior to, I think, I'll say COVID, just to give a break in the timeline. But yeah, we definitely don't see a ton.
Thank you, Tiffany. What about the Métis Crossing? Do you know?
If we see Ukrainian visitors there, yes. And actually, they have this buffet where on Sundays, they often make it like a Ukrainian Métis food, sort of like there's pierogies and cabbage rolls and all these amazing, delightful things. So there's quite strong partnerships there. And I was talking to Leon about it, and he just kept going on and on and on. And it happened throughout our construction projects. And so I just think it's an area that's deeply embedded with, it's Smoky Lake, so the most amazing bakery is there, and they're Ukrainian run. It's just because of proximity. There is a lot of free flow of trade and economic prosperity between all of them together.
Thank you.
Thank you both. The next question is from Ashley Halko Adley, and I'm really pleased to read it because a similar question has been brewing in my mind listening to both of you. So Ashley says, I work for Saskatchewan Parks, and one of our sites is Fort Carlton. This area was an important annual gathering place for Indigenous people, so Hudson's Bay Company established a trading post at this location. As an important trade location, it operated for 75 years and eventually became the location for the negotiations and signing of Treaty 6. It is an important space for both historic and contemporary Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations. We are continually looking for ways to make our space more than just a museum and have it act as a gathering space again. My question is, as gathering spaces, how do your spaces go beyond their original or main intent to create spaces that are welcoming to diverse groups of people? Who would like to go first?
That's a really good question. I'm not surprised. We've got in the audience today, someone thinking about these things on this deeper level. The first thing that comes to my mind about this is the changes that we've been making in our interpretive program and in our programming at the Ukrainian Village to just generally make our site more inclusive to people. When the village was established, we always tell the story that it was a time when everyone had a grandpa or an uncle or someone on a farm, and they could go out to the farm and, we mentioned earlier, get that contact with, an original homestead or the agricultural way of life. And now the vast majority of our audience is urban, right? It's urban dwellers from the Edmonton area. And so we've had to shift our interpretation, and we've had to shift our programming to, recognize that our audiences have shifted. Their background knowledge is different than it once was. We have more people who are further removed from, you know, the traditional cultural practice of their ancestors, and they're coming to us to learn about it. And so we need to make sure that we're helping, you know, include them in our version of Ukrainian community. And it's helping to make our whole site more inclusive by saying, you know, the stories that we tell aren't just a Ukrainian story, and they're not just relevant to Ukrainians, and challenging ourselves to, you know, change the way we talk about topics in history to make it inclusive for other people, you know. And it's simple as, you know, words that we choose to use about when we're talking about the past. Our site used to talk a lot about, you know, pioneers and the triumph of the pioneers over the untamed wilderness, and we don't use language like that anymore because, you know, we just didn't feel that that was inclusive to, you know, the acknowledging the experiences of everyone else who was, you know, living on this land well before settlers got here. So it's, you know, a series of little changes to just generally make our site and make our programming more inclusive and relevant to people. I think when, you know, I think of interpretation and programming, that relevance piece is always really important, right? How is this relevant to someone's life? Is it, you know, an opportunity to get out of the city, like Tiffany was talking about, and get into nature and get into the countryside? Is it an opportunity to connect with your past? What's that relevance? I think helps make it attractive to people.
Yeah, I also loved this question too. I liked how you answered it, Pam. I think that's a key consideration as well for Métis Crossing. How we deal with it though structurally is accessibility, making sure that, like, really looking at, you know, is there a step that people have to go up above? Like, was people different mobility or different aging systems? We really try to focus on what is the experience of the visitor from once they leave their car to moving around the site. And so accessibility is always a really prime consideration for any of the things that happen at Métis Crossing, because actually there really are not a lot of places that cater to accessibility. It's just because of the way code has developed over time, and people in a wheelchair are really bound to where they can go. That's one way. Another thing is that you know, Métis Crossing is for Métis people, and it is also for people to come and learn about Métis people. So they have to think, what is their educational program? So it's really around this idea of reconciliation through the guise of education. And I'm not a person who personally believes in reconciliation. I believe in conciliation. But I do really appreciate how Métis Crossing uses tourism through a layer of reconciliation, which is a little more friendlier and far more impactful, because when people are there going about their day to go on a tour to look at bison, you know, they're softer in their heart and open in their ears about what experiences they might have had racism towards or bias towards prior, because people beside them of their attitudes that haven't developed or shifted over time. So I think education is a prime component. Also, I just think you should call me, because the kind of project that you're talking about is the very thing that I live for, in terms of we're always looking for different ways to tell the story differently. Another project that you can look at that I'm their project architect on them with them right now, which is the confluence for the site concept development, which is Fort Calgary. They've renamed themselves to the Confluence, and I love how they just rebranded themselves last year, and they said how they have, because it's the knowledge there has mostly been pushed by the RCMP, because the RCMP formed that fort. And so it's been a bit of a difficult juncture. So what they say is that they're forming together two narratives, like the two rivers that form together there, and that it's just a flow that we have to move through. So I can, in this chat, I'll send you another document that they have done that I think you'll really love. But you can also just call me, and I can delightfully talk to you about other strategies that you're thinking about, because that's an amazing project you're working on.
It sounds fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Tiffany. We are almost out of time. We are coming to an end of our webinar, but we'll ask one last question. Many words of appreciation for what people are hearing today, and talking about education. So after sharing both stories, if any of the panelists can speak to what they wish our past and or current educational curriculums would include in terms of the history of Ukrainian and Métis culture and communities within our very diverse communities here in Canada. Thank you.
That is another excellent question. That is a huge, timely question, as you know, we face you know, curriculum redevelopment and new curriculum here in Alberta. I immediately go to the bigger topics. You know, of course, I would love to have our specific story told in classrooms across Alberta, but I know that every community has their own valuable, important, relevant stories that need to be taught and told in classrooms. And so I look at the bigger concept of just appreciation of the past, understanding of how to look at the past, how to explore the past, how to, you know, value the traditional forms of knowing and learning that all our different cultures have. And if we can facilitate through the curriculum, and you know, gosh, don't ask me to put this on paper and to turn this into action, but if we can facilitate people developing the skills to look at history and the skills to value and appreciate history and learn from it in their own communities, I think that would go a long way towards people being able to be really good citizens in their own neighborhood and value the stories of everyone around them, whatever those specific stories might be.
Yeah, your answer is better than mine. I think that what I was thinking about is the way I see curriculum now with my children is so different. Like my children are still in elementary, so they'll have like bannock for lunch, which was just not an offering when I was going to school, or just an acknowledgement of being Indigenous as something to be proud of. That's totally different as well. And people will try to access me to help develop curriculum, but I'm not an educator, I'm a designer. And so I always really struggle with how to interact, because I do have knowledge that I'd like to share or requests for what my children would learn. For example, I'm just coming at through this lens just for this answer. And, you know, just to add to what Pam is saying, is the desire for what you want. I also wonder if you could reflect on your desire of observation, because right now I feel like, for me, I'm just witnessing what's happening, which is just as important as being an active participant. And so I have been really enjoying witnessing others do the work and how they're sharing this knowledge, because I know how I feel, and I know a lot of my own family history through a lot of my own research, which is not in a lot of these curriculums. And it's just by nature of, there's just a lot to do, and there's a lot of different people with different biases putting these curriculums together. That just is what it is, the way it ends up. And I don't want to undo the work that people are doing. You know, it's always better to make it fuller. But I just do think that still there is a real power to just witnessing and observing, because sometimes there's a time for action and there's a time for collective observation. And what, you know, I assume that will change into action later on, but they're both important.
Myrna, I see your hand raised. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah. We're overwhelmed these days with what's going on in the United States and the pushback against so many of the achievements that people have struggled for at least a generation, if not more. And I'm particularly referring here to the shutdown of the so-called DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion, I think, initiatives in educational institutions and so on, federally funded programs. Is there a whiff of that yet? Have you felt, Tiffany and Pamela, in terms of your interaction with the authorities that might want to push back against so-called wokeism in what you're trying to do, and your inclusivity of programming? And
I feel like people are more empowered, actually. I feel like it just brings people out of the woodwork. I mean, I'm a crazy, weird optimist, where like the more depressed things get, the more I'm kind of excited about like, what's the weakness that's happening? What's the fissure? Where's the cracks? And I'm always just thinking about what are the opportunities of what this moment is preparing us for. So there is a lot of backlash, of course, around diversity and equity in a lot of these conversations. But I think actually right now, by keeping a clear voice, it helps empower people differently now than it did before. So I think there is good and bad happening right now.
And I think just from my perspective, we're in a different situation where Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian history has, I'll call it's been in kind of a privileged place in people looking at it and really valuing it and wanting to understand it, and wanting to support Ukrainians through the last, I guess now 3 years since 2022. But in our museum, when we started to change up our messaging and try to integrate different messages and experiences into our programming that were more inclusive of everyone's story in East Central Alberta, one of the things we were worried about reaction to it. We were worried about how our traditional audiences would respond to that. And we haven't received any pushback. We haven't received any blowback. If anything, we've received we've received a lot more curiosity. It's been received with curiosity and openness, which we were very pleased about. And so I think that just that sense of curiosity persists in Alberta and in the audiences that I work with.
Thank you so much. And the testament of the interest is all our events. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we had 119 people registered. And thank you. Thank you for this inspiring, warm conversation. One of our goals is to create these inclusive spaces where we can raise those questions, where we can talk about good stories, but also wonder and remember maybe sometimes not very positive stories. So thank you. It has been a pleasure. We have many good words in our chat. I know that the conversation between Tiffany and Pamela will continue, and I hope our conversations will continue. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and all information, all the resources will be posted on our website together with the video recording. And we do have a plan for the fall programming. Stay tuned. Thank you on behalf of all of us. Indigenous Ukrainian Relationship Initiative. Yuri, thank you. До побачення. Thank you. Дякую.